Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome to this episode of A View from Afar. And in this episode, political scientist and former Pentagon analyst Paul Buchanan and we're going to deep dive into the systemic change and how to plan ahead in a fast transitional period. Now, the topics we're going to discuss today are systemic change, geopolitical change, normative change, and structural change. And Paul and I will also discuss how to apply those into what we are seeing in the world stage at this time. We'll also be looking at, things like the clarity of planning and purpose when considering strategic and technical hedging and thinking in that regard. So let's deep dive into these issues with Paul, and we'll take the conversation to a deeper level of understanding. But before we do this, and before we begin this live recording, we invite you to subscribe, like, and click notifications in the YouTube link that you may see in front of you. And that's so that you do not miss other future live episodes. So with that said and done, just remember that if you are joining us live, YouTube is the best place for that. And for those of you that are on YouTube, you can lodge those questions, but I just underscore here, remember that while we record this live episode, your comments and questions can be included in this program. So with all that said and done, let's cross to Paul, who is waiting to get into this issue. We might even, in the brief opening lines, make a mention of the Football World Cup. Kia ora, Paul. Tēnā koe e ho. How are you going there?
Kia ora, Selwyn. Yes, there's World Cup fever in the Buchanan household. I think everybody who listens to us, or at least has any knowledge of us, knows that I was raised in Argentina. So you can figure who I'm rooting for. I'm actually going to record the All Whites because their game conflicts with us doing our podcast. We shall see. Quality of play has been very good. The Minnows are actually doing very well. Cape Verde tied with Spain and is just tied with Uruguay. Cape Verde has about 500,000 people throughout the archipelago. So living in a small country like New Zealand, I'm sure someone understands the sentiment. We sort of go for the little guys. But very good entertainment value, I got to say. And so long as Brazil doesn't win, I will be happy.
Before we came on live, I wound Paul up in a very dry way with a serious face. Asked him what he thought of the Brazil opening match, but he came back with.
He got me. He got me.
So, Paul, let's get into this. Let's go down deep into the structural theoretical, and if you take us through it, and for those that are listening, what I'll try to do, and add in your comments here too, but what I will attempt to do is where I think we need a little bit of discussion around certain points. If we feel like we need to bring that theory out, make your comments in the box there, and we'll bring those into the program. But looking forward to this, Paul, and then we'll apply it to what we're seeing in the world stage at the moment, over the halfway mark of the program, won't we, Paul? So over to you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that when I do hear from our listeners, they fairly consistently say they like the depth of how we frame things, that we don't do laundry lists of, he said, she said, current events, that we actually try to put it in, context. And I had a series of professional talks to give this month, and to audiences that were not experts, they were just professional audiences from various industries. And, I got to thinking, too much is happening. If I just go the last 48 hours, there's just so much to discuss. But why not try to create a framing device and break down the sort of general situation, which you and I, Selwyn, have talked about a lot over the past 5 years, and sort of just bring it all together, but in a reframed way. So, not using the language that you and I, long transition, all that sort of stuff, we've been there, done it. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. But once I've framed things for us, then, and we may want to pause a bit there, I want to talk about a syndrome that impedes us dealing with the world around us, that overcomes, among other things, that syndrome that I'll mention in a second. And again, for those who are regular listeners, you will see that a lot of what I say today is basically summarizing and synthesizing things that Selwyn and I have talked about over the last 5 years, just using a different way of looking at it. So here goes. The first thing that we have to realize is we're reaching the crest of a wave. Crest of a wave, that long transition stuff, all that is now, it's reaching its peak. And so we're now engaging in what I'll call systemic change. The order of things is being fundamentally altered. But I think we need to break down systemic change into three component parts. The first one is geopolitical change, and I'll start with that. The second one is normative change, and we're going to continue on to that. And we wind up with structural change, which again, we've talked about, but I've got some new insights. Again, I read a lot, so I've seen some very interesting non-traditional international relations commentary that I think is worth incorporating. So let's first start with geopolitical change. It's ironic for me, having studied under some of the great strategists, or at least US strategists of the late 20th century, to see how geopolitics has become one of the buzzwords, for the mass media and whatnot. Geopolitical this. And it's funny because if you're trained in the old way, like in my case, by realists and whatnot, you got to go back and read Thucydides. You've got to read, the old geopolitical theorists. So, Mackinder, McMahon. I mean, there's a bunch of it. And traditionally, geopolitical analysis focuses on continental geopolitics, which is where land-based countries or countries with large land borders, how they fight, how they strategize a fight, usually based on having large armies to deal with invaders and all that stuff to project force. Then, of course, there is maritime geopolitics, which the UK used to be the exemplar, project power over blue water and secure far-off places using your naval power. And more recently, there's aerospace geopolitics, started in the early 20th century with the introduction of aircraft into World War I. And it basically says if you dominate the sky, you dominate the land. And that's an American-based geopolitical thought. It's deeply flawed. In fact, it's wrong. But that hasn't stopped the Americans from continuing to do it. We've just seen them try to apply it against Iran because they're averse to land casualties. See, if you're going to do a land-based strategy, you got to be able to take losses.
Yeah,
and the Americans, right. So, but they'd love to put boots if they could have a party, but these guys are going to die, and they don't like that. Bloodshed, not so good unless it's the other guy. So those are the three traditional ones, but they're based on one basic assumption. Geopolitics is no more than no less than the relationship between politics and geography. Politics writ large, as including economics, including diplomacy, obviously military aspects, and even cultural aspects. When we think of soft power, but it's all rooted in that relationship between geography and politics writ large. Now, normally, the concept is conceived as static. That is, you gain control of important landmarks, geographic features. So, of course, what's the other buzzword these days? Choke points. So, narrows and straits, because those who control the littoral waters of various straits can control the passage of traffic. And there's variations there. But the idea is geography is fixed. And so it's, a matter of fortune that you happen to be there on its shores, let's say in the case of the Persians. And then the politics swirls around it. Okay, so the politics is the stream that flows around these fixed geographic points. Well, that's no longer true. And this is where I think a lot of the mass media interpretations, they're not getting it, because two things have happened to geopolitics, I would say. The first one is human produced, and that's technological advancement. We can now do things to our environment that we could not do 100 years ago during the heyday of geopolitical thought. In the old days, you were confronted with geography. Now we control geography. Think, for example, of undersea cables, undersea mining. What used to be impossible is now, in fact, commercially viable. Uh, think of space navigation. Uh, there's always been thought of warfare in space, but geopolitics is more than warfare. And so we're starting to see now the exploitation of space. One of the things that have come up in recent days is that because of the opposition to building large scale data centers on Earth that use enormous amounts of energy, and water, it is now technologically feasible to put them into space, to put large orbiting data centers in low altitude orbits to service human needs. Now that comes with a whole host of human problems. But, my point is that simply we are dominating nature in a way that is equivalent to the Industrial Revolution. And that's one of the big parts of this systemic change. This is one of those, if you will, evolutionary leaps in technology, this era, that the only equivalent is the Industrial Revolution. But let us remember, the Industrial Revolution brought good and bad. It brought, yes, the era of machines, but it also led directly to the Great Depression. So there's two sides to that evolutionary leap, which again is human caused. And I would say it's because it's human caused. There's always a downside when humans get involved. So we have the ability now to control nature, remake nature, do those sort of things in a measure that we didn't have before, and it changes power dynamics. For example, if you're a maritime operator, or if you're a naval person in particular, you'll always have a pretty acute interest in the waters near Suva in Fiji. Normally, we think it's a lazy tourist destination, certain nice surf breaks, but it turns out that the waters outside Suva it's where the main fiber optic cable connecting LA to Sydney passes through a terminal in Suva. In fact, it comes out of the water so that it can be inspected and repaired and that sort of thing. As a result of that, let's just say there's an unusual amount of submarine movement in the waters right outside of Fiji, because submarines, as it turns out, are very important intelligence collection platforms. They shoot ships and they shoot missiles, but day in and day out, they are listening devices writ large. And so Fiji occupies a disproportionate strategic importance for navies, for big navies with submarines. And that wasn't the case, of course, 50, 60 years ago. So on the one hand, we have a technological change now allowing us to dominate nature in the way we did at the onset of the Industrial Revolution. On the other hand, we have climate change. Now, I'm not going to even argue about whether climate change is human induced or not. I'm just going to point you to a couple of facts. The Arctic pack ice is melting. And whether it was done by us or it's a 5,000 year cycle, the northern passage between Europe and Asia is now open. That opens all sorts of geopolitical implications. The Russians have already put boundary markers up around the North Pole, staking their claim. And just think of the critical minerals and stuff that are below that ice pack. By the same token, the ice shelves and the ice pack in Antarctica is A, retreating, and B, drying out, evaporating. So the rush is on now for mining exploration in Antarctica. You know, countries that have nothing to do with Antarctica, you know, are now seeking to get down there and establish commercial bases. So the combination of technological advancement and climate change, for whatever reason, has opened geopolitical possibilities and has changed the strategic calculus of many countries which seek to exploit their position, favorable or disfavorable, in the geographic landscape. So it's not just traditional choke points, but then there is that. What countries have learned, and this will be just one brief on current events. I think we've already discussed this, but if people don't realize it, Iran has won this war pretty decisively, as it turns out. Their closure, we know it's not a closure, it was an imposition of tolls. The lessons have been learned. Other countries are going to follow suit. The finance minister of Indonesia has already proposed that Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia impose a toll system in the Moluccan Strait. And they already have a tripartite commission that is responsible for maintenance and safety regulation and all of that. So his proposal is we make it a toll agency as well, and we just charge people maintenance fees for passing through the Moluccan Strait. So far, he's been rebuffed, but that's not going away. So too, people have now looked back at the Taiwan Strait. 80% of the traffic coming out of the South China Sea goes inside of Taiwan, closer to the mainland shores. The Chinese, at any moment, could decide that they could impose a toll system that would basically choke off Japan if they wanted to do so. And if we remember that canals, because they go through the territory of a nation state, are already told. The Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, they're all told already. There is a bit of a precedent. And I'll come back to that in a second. So basically, the geopolitical equation is a lot more fluid than it's traditionally thought of, and it's not as dependent on fixed location as much as the ability to technologically exploit whatever locations are made strategically available to countries and non-state actors that have the physical capability to do so. So that's the first breakdown. The second one is because of these changes, we have, as Selwyn and I have talked a lot, a rupture in the rules-based and normative order of the liberal international system. Contrary to many people here in New Zealand, it's done. It's finished. Absolutely finished. We in New Zealand cling to the idea that we can somehow regain the rules-based order. And that's a pipe dream. And I wish our policymakers would wise up in a hurry. But it works this way. If you think, no, Paul's just, being cynical and whatnot. Let me give you some examples. We talk a lot now about freedom of navigation. Well, guess what? Talk about freedom of navigation has gone on for a millennia. The Greeks talked about it. But the arrangements made to allow safe passage on the open seas was done bilaterally or multilaterally, like Selwyn and I have talked about minilateral compacts and that sort of thing. It's not natural law. It's not a universal construct that the goddess laid down on us. In fact, the first international law governing freedom of navigation came in 1958 with the Convention on High Seas, modified in 1982 with the Convention on the Law of the High Seas, and it hasn't been ratified by many countries, including the United States. The United States has not ratified the main international instrument for regulating freedom of navigation. Oh boy,
so there was a significant precedence to the exit of ratifying the International Criminal Court back in the early 2000s.
And let's just think of it this way. They squawk a lot about the Iranians, and again, I'll come back to that in a second. But they're killing people on the open seas without evidence, saying they're drug smugglers. They've killed over 250 people in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. They're on the open seas. And so the normal name for that is piracy. But when a state does it, you come up with all these normative justifications. Well, the hard fact is that the laws of the sea, the freedom of navigation, are barely worth the paper that they are written on. And the worst violator in recent times is not Iran, it's the United States. Now, let's take another so-called fundamental: the right to asylum, the right to seek refugee status because you fear something in your own country. That was first mentioned in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was put into practice in the 1951 Convention on Refugees. Look at where we are today. Look at where we are today. Under the 1951 Convention, when you set foot in another country and ask for asylum, you must be granted at least a hearing to hear the merits of your case. In the United States, we're rounding people up and sending them not even back to their own countries, sending them to third countries. In Europe, there is a massive right-wing backlash against, I would just say simply, people of color, people of different cultures. The whole idea of refugees is turned into they're illegal aliens.
I'd add too that in this region of the world, in our part of the blue continent, Australia had a form of this by sending asylum seekers to Christmas Island and other places off the Australian continent, pending some sort of outcome. And Paul would well remember the reportage that we all did at the time with people sewing their mouths up in protest because they said we would rather die from hunger and hunger strike than to be spending our lifetime existence in this awful place. It's had its parallels, and it seems universal, and it does seem to span the regions of the world.
Yeah, and it's a great illustration because it just shows you that too, an international convention, has been systematically violated for years. And as some pundit wrote somewhere, they said, well, maybe the good thing about the current era is that the hypocrisy or the veil of hypocrisy has been removed. And now we're just nakedly racist, xenophobic, whatever. My point simply is there is no normative order. And we've talked about it a lot, times of transition and all of that. But I thought that I needed to give some concrete evidence of that. And those two, one is about the movement of merchandise, the other one is about the movement of people. Two fundamental concepts of liberal internationalism, and they have been destroyed, ironically, by the liberal West. The
Yeah.
greatest
So,
offenders.
so I'll put a little bit of a question here too. From the point of view of what you've just laid out here, and that the evidence of hypocrisy has gone on for some time. For those that subscribe to the view that there was a degree of international order, is it that hypocrisy has been that mask of hypocrisy that we have said in previous episodes? It's like with Trump. It's the mask of hypocrisy has been pulled off, and what you're seeing is an administration that unashamedly says, "This is us." So getting back to that, is that mask of hypocrisy the thread that is held together some sort of multilateral order? And if so, what do we do to actually restitch something that would be progress in the name of predictability and assurance of engagement with a world that is in transition?
Well, I mean, there's a bias for hope in all of this because my understanding is the global South, when it was allowed to play by the liberal internationalist rules and work through their institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, those sort of things. They played the hypocrisy game. They could be authoritarian at home, but then very liberal in their interactions. Diplomats are all well educated, usually elite people. I think this allows us to go deeper than that. That is to say, if we remove the veil of hypocrisy from the West, it will allow countries in the South that do not conform totally to the West's image of them or demands of them to participate more in the international system, and that will allow for reform of international institutions. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can keep international institutions, but they need a greater Southern presence. That, to me, is the bottom line.
And when
And
Paul
there,
refers to Southern, it's not a geographical construct. It's
right, it's the global South.
Yeah.
Right. For listeners, when I say global South, Selwyn says global South, we're referring to basically a post-colonial mentality. Countries that have suffered under the yoke of imperialism and colonialism, they got a different view of things. And that can be old colonialism like the Spanish or the British in India, or it can be relatively recent colonialism. The political science in my house and I were talking about the Belgians and how, they're the horror show that was Belgian colonialism in sub-Saharan Africa. And how that's now being played out in the World Cup, of all things. African countries that were exposed to Belgian colonialism root against the Belgian team because of the historical antecedents that come with it. So I think there is the possibility of reform based on lifting the veil. The point is, right now, we don't have the solution set, although I'll try to mention what I think might be a good idea. So the rules of the game are gone, and we haven't quite reestablished, the new rules. The geopolitical order is in flux. What's left? Oh, we're moving to what you and I have talked in the past to be a constellation multipolar order So there's constellation of state and non-state actors grouping together over specific common interests and that sort of thing. I think we can actually expand on that. And I will change my terminology and my way of thinking because what I think we're moving to is a polycentric order. And the reason for that is because when we think of multipolarity, we think of nation states. We think power as vested in duly constituted governments of territorially demarked actors, state
or
actors.
or the supposed claim of like-minded countries.
Yeah, I mean, again, it gets back to your issue of rules, okay? Because you may not be like-minded, but you've got to interact. And so there's got to be some sort of common ground. But what I think we're looking at, and it goes back to what I was saying about technological advancement and this new, industrial revolution, technological revolution, is that we now have non-state actors coming in who have power bases that are bigger than most nation states. If you look at Amazon, if you look at Elon Musk's empire, they have GDPs that are bigger than, the greatest, well, everybody but the greatest powers. More importantly, they have influence. If they want to command a private army, it'll be there within days. To me, they are extremely dangerous. They are unregulated. They're the people who are going to put the data centers up in space. I see conflict coming with that. But my point is, the notion of the nation state as being the primary actor of international relations is being eroded before our eyes. And so we have vestiges of multipolarity. Nation states will get together. There's a lot of talk now in light of the insanity that is the United States for middle powers to create new alliances that are not NATO, not the old Cold War models. Go with middle powers because the great powers are unreliable for the rest of us. Right? Yeah. China and the US can square off, but we're not part of that deal. So I like it. I like the idea that we're moving in a polycentric way in light of the changes that I've described above. And that leads me then to what's the syndrome? Why are we holding back? Why can't we get our heads around where we're at? Embrace the uncertainty, as you and I have talked about so many times before. Why can't we do it? And the answer is in that notion known as institutional lag. And for those who don't remember the conversation that we had a while back, the notion of institutional lag basically refers to the time it takes between an external event and an organizational response. It comes out of management theory and organizational theory, but it applies to all complex organizations. Why? Because complex organizations are built on status quos, procedures, rules, regulations that were appropriate at a given time. But the externality may have rendered them obsolete or archaic. But because the status quos had survived and reproduced over time, this is what makes big corporations, even states, have their power. They develop a type of bureaucratic inertia. People are content. It delivers the goods as is. And so humans are very reluctant, uh, except for times of calamity, to change their ways. Be it
and
in
I'll just add
diplomacy.
in on that just a couple of observations just to help connect, perhaps. I mean, we all see institutional lag to a degree. It may be in the workplace. We may work for a corporation where we can see ourselves as individuals there needs to be change to policies or the way we approach a particular task or production. If we did that, we'd be able to be better than we are. And the cumbersome nature of a large entity holds back that thinking sometimes. We see it, for example, when there's a change of parties in government. You might see that the incumbents lose an election, and then you'll see perhaps the policies of the new ones coming in that are cause effect solution in their orientation, heavy on the solution in the election campaign. The public may get in behind those or those versions of solution, and then you see an inertia. The cumbersome nature of and structure of government slows down the enthusiasm for change. Those types of things. So we see it all the time in our lives, and it's a fascinating thing. And I just wanted to nudge that forward, Paul, so that you can pick up on that next part in the discussion and perhaps refer to those illustrations there.
Yeah, no, the point is very good. I mean, remember the old adage that generals are always preparing for the last war.
Yeah.
It's another manifestation of that. But I'll tell you two things that interested me. In order to develop my thought on institutional lag, I did a little more reading. I'm not an expert in organizational theory and those sort of things. But I thought, I'll go have a look because maybe there's some sophisticated analysis that I'm missing. Well, it turns out there's not. In fact, it's amazing. You may or may not be familiar with the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief.
Yeah.
And basically, it's a way to deal with death. And so first there is denial, then there is acceptance or resignation, then there is acceptance, and you move on until you can resume your life. Well, organizational theory takes Kubler-Ross, adds a couple of phases, so it's 7 stages, and applies them to complex organizations. That's the same thing. And it's like when you have an external event, and I'm about to mention one, you're not, this is not a grief thing. I mean, it's a bummer. The way you did things, it's over. But you don't go through, denial. Well, maybe they do. Again, I'm not a manager. But my point was, okay, the intellectual foundations of the institutional lag theorists are pretty shallow.
Yeah,
and
you might
so
look
that
at
means,
that part of denial. It might be risk averseness that kind of overcomes the thinking at the front end, perhaps.
well, here's a concrete example. And again, you're a businessman as well as a journal, so you can illuminate me on this one. But during the pandemic and after the pandemic, we heard that things had to change. We had to do near shoring, friend shoring. We had to do hub and spoke, regional hub and spokes. So there wasn't commodity concentration in production in places like the People's Republic of China. We heard all about that. Things are gonna change. And I don't have the exact figures, but in reading about this, it's something like 70% of the businesses involved in global trade did not change a thing. They just waited until the pandemic was over and then boom, boom, back to business as usual because they have all those sunken costs. I was particularly fascinated with just in time production because what made the pandemic, one of the reasons the pandemic became an economic problem was that the supply chain depended, you would receive orders and then you would make the product and then ship it out. Unlike during the industrial age, where companies made products, inventory, or put them in warehouses, and then waited for the orders to come. There was always a supply. But in the late 20th century, they switched over to just in time. And one of the arguments was, okay, just in time's got to go because now we're chasing, the post-pandemic ripple. That hasn't happened. And so in the face of a global pandemic, that costs trillions of dollars and millions of lives, 70% of capitalists who depend on trade decided to go back to the old way. Uh, that's institutional lag at its finest. They just don't want to react. Now, maybe the crisis in the Straits of Hormuz will shake some of these people out of their lethargy. But that gets to my third point, because why are we continuing to look at the Strait of Hormuz? Why are we diversifying, beyond clean energy and getting off of fossil fuels? You know, why don't we start thinking of solutions to getting around that literal bottleneck? And so I think we have to understand that institutional lag is a human thing. It's embedded in us. Again, that inertia, we like our status quos. I was trying to tell my soon to be 13-year-old son, we're comfort in our routine. We're comfortable in our routines of our way of doing things, like the morning routine, getting ready for school. We don't want to change, okay? We're settled, but something happens. The house catches fire. Now we're going to have to change. We're going to have to do a different routine. And so if you write that large, that's what we have to do when there's times of crisis. And this transitional moment is a time of crisis, no doubt about it. So what are solution sets to that? And again, I'm not a psychologist, but I would suggest that we have to engage in, we have to be what so many people pay lip service to, which is resilient. And I can tell you, Selwyn, after the cyclone here, that word really began to irritate me, because everybody and his sister was talking about resilience, be resilient. Auckland Council, resilience, resilient. You're not out here, okay? You're not living in mudslides and completely cut off
Look,
from the world.
In my view, resilience in that context is simply a fork away from personal responsibility, and that's probably why you found it so offensive, because that illustrates a number of things for you.
No, I like the way you phrase that. Look, I really like the way you just phrased that. But so we talk a lot about resilience, but resilience again. Today's my day for one-liners. So geopolitics, geography, politics. In this instance, resilience is just flexibility and adaptability, or adaptability via flexibility. We've got to be flexible in the face of external events that change our world. I mean, that's it. As I also say to the 13-year-old, you've got to realize that there are some things you cannot control. You don't have agency. And so you've got to find a way, if not accept it, how to resist it, just, without getting yourself in trouble. And therein is where the strategies come in. Okay, so how are we flexible and adaptable in the face of the institutional lag that is failing to cope with the systemic changes that are all around us? And I would say, actually, it starts out with what most people associate with gambling, and that is the concept of hedging. But hedging is, we hear it gambling. Okay, the person is stonewalling. What was the other one? Stonewalling and sandbagging. So, you bet a lot and you have no hand, or you have a really good hand and you eke out your bets trying to sucker the other people in. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about tactical and strategic hedging. Tactical hedging is you deal with the problem. The problem that's right out here. A classic case in point, because unfortunately New Zealand policymakers are so short-sighted, is this right-wing government here is very proud of the fact that we had fuel supplies for 51 days. And really made a big bunch. We've got enough for, 51 days is, not quite 2 months. But you seem to think this is great, as if the Straits of Hormuz are going to open up, and as if all of a sudden boats will develop airplane wings and be delivering, back supplies immediately. I mean, it's like, you guys are smoking some of them left-handed cigarettes if you believe that. So that's their thinking, that's their tactical response. We got 51 days. Meanwhile, the People's Republic of China, when asked the same questions about their fuel supplies, they had a double answer. They said over the near term, we've got 6 months of reserves. Over the long term, we've got electric cars. Okay, we're invested completely in getting vehicles off of fossil fuels. How do you like them apples? And so it goes to show you, the Chinese are doing strategic hedging.
Yeah.
Little old New Zealand.
I was just going to do that. They've already strategically mapped out the course. They know where they're going. They know their transition, and they know the journey that they're on. The tactical response is still doesn't offend that strategic thinking, the strategic goals that they've set. And it's a very interesting definition, because we do see, and I think your illustration of New Zealand choices and decisions that were made expose the lack of strategic thinking. If you look at the government that is in play now, New Zealand's, on an energy basis, New Zealand's strategic decision making and its goal sets weren't too far away from what you just, I don't mean the timeframes, but I mean the aspirational goal settings, weren't too different to the PRC of what you've just illustrated there. But with the change of government, they abandoned many of those, went back to perhaps what some could argue 20th century ideals, as opposed to 21st century energy realistic goals. And their tactical response to this particular crisis has caught them up, both from a point of view of their policy sets and also their hypocrisy and their rhetoric. So it's an interesting kind of thing. And I thank you for that illustration. Paul, before we go further on this, I just thought now was a good time to bring in some of the comments and questions that have come in from the floor. I've selected some that have responded, some of the questions and comments that have responded to directly to the discussion that you've brought to the table today. David Mooring, as always, David Mooring is very lively in the comments, and I thank David for that. And I'll bring them up as I address them. And Paul, if it's okay, I'll just read through about 4, and then you may see commonality in the questions and respond in that respect. But here we go first. David Mooring, couldn't the fibre optic cables, we're getting back to the Fijian references that you made, the Fiji Suva reference, David says, couldn't the fibre optic cables themselves be able to be used to detect submarines via signal monitoring and feedback reflection? And David also, he gave a context to what he was meaning there. Frequency analysis over fibre can be used to pick up sounds, David asserts there. He also then put in here lower cost submersible drone, and he's talking on another point that you raised here. Lower cost submersible drone may just open up seas, making surface and subsurface traffic as visible as drones have done in the Ukrainian battlefields. So I think in that context, he was talking about straits like the Strait of Hormuz and others, and he's picked up on that idea there. He puts the issues here relating to data centers. How will they call those data centers in space? And makes the comment it's pure insanity. So, Paul, I just, it's been a lively session in the comments there, and encourage others to join in that as well. But back to you, Paul, on some of those points that you may see as interesting to respond to.
Yeah, so the general, and good afternoon, David. Thanks for coming on the show. What you're focusing on, are the technological aspects. And we've got to focus more on the human aspects, like regulating out of space data centers. My understanding, the engineers are saying because deep space is cold, the heating issues that come with, the need of water on Earth and whatnot are far diminished. And they've got plenty of solar, needless to say, so that many of those technological obstacles in space have already been, factored into the equation and overcome. As you know, David, I'm sure, in warfare and intelligence, you play both offense and defense. Fiber optic cables are continually being modernized, often by military services. And so, what you just said about reflected sound and listening to the listeners already being done, but it's a cat and mouse game, mate. And there's a lot of people involved in playing that game, which includes underwater drones. And that brings a good point. I didn't mention it, but one of the things about these traditional maritime chokeholds is that they're shallow. And so, for example, you may say to yourself, why don't the Americans put submarines in there and blow things up and clear a passage? Because they're too easily detected. The deepest part of the Hormuz Strait is 250 feet, and that's that main shipping channel. You try to put a sub in there, I mean, anybody with a tin can and a string can hear this thing coming through. So, physical limitations do matter. And of course, what the Iranians are doing, and I'll just do a brief aside here. You may remember that Selwyn and I said a long time ago, I had discovered that the Persians invented chess and carpet weaving. And it was relevant to our discussions because those two endeavors require patience, discipline, and lateral thinking. You take your time. And so it's Persians. And so these Persians are confronting the United States in war. The United States are about getting everything yesterday, instant gratification. Bomb them from the air, but don't suffer any casualties on the ground. Whereas we haven't discussed it a lot, but usually victory in war doesn't go to the people who kill more people from the other side. It goes to the people who can absorb losses and keep on fighting. That's the Persians. And you see what's eventuated. Well, the Iranians knew that they didn't have to constantly try to get boats out there to shoot at merchant ships. They had drones. In fact, they have drone swarms. They have missiles. And most importantly, they have capitalism. Why? Because the greatest threat to the Straits of Hormuz merchant traffic are Western insurers, insurance companies. All the Iranians have to do is fire a missile across the Persian Gulf. All the Iranians have to do is fly a drone into a dhow somewhere in the Persian Gulf, and that's it. The insurance are we're not risking it. And the shipping companies, needless to say, they're like, okay, the Iranians want $1 million per boat for safe passages. The insurers want $5 million because they are going to have to cover the cost of the destroyed boat. So the Iranians are playing with capitalism. They're just going, hey, you guys made the game, and we're just taking advantage of it. We're using the insurers to drive home our point.
I'll just point out one factor there. Some of the disruptions, shall we say, to the supposed negotiations towards some sort of peace endeavour, that Trump seems to want to actually collect the ticket, not the Iranians, in the Strait of Hormuz. So these are minor points on the bigger picture, but there is certainly interesting factors there. Well, let's thank you for addressing those from the floor. Let's get back to the backbone of what you're saying and moving forward on that now.
Yeah. So I was thinking. Okay, we have this situation, the way I framed it, the systemic change broken into three component parts. we've got this problem, which is institutional lag, which is a human syndrome we need to address when confronting systemic change. Things are not going to be the way they were. We better get on with it. And how to get on with it? Well, strategic and tactical hedging. Of course, you're going to do tactical hedging because the problem's right there in front of you. But that's not enough. And again, I'm not calling for, greenies hugging trees and whatnot, but we've got to think through the global model of production and where not just physical, but one might say intellectual or just human or cultural, I don't have that quite down yet, choke points exist. Barriers to getting out of doing things as usual. And I'll illustrate this again. I hate to use New Zealand so much, but I learned a lesson from a former student about this bureaucratic inertia, not wanting to break out of the mold. The former student worked for a small chicken company in New Zealand. So not the biggest producer, but a significant producer. And he quit. And he said, I can't stay. And he was a well-paid high manager. He said, because they have no desire to innovate. They have no desire to do anything other than what they're doing. Why? They're a family-owned business. They've never gone public. They are multimillionaires. They pay their workers low wages, and they simply do not, they're comfortable. They're extremely comfortable. They're part of New Zealand's 1%, and no one's pushing them to change because the big guys like having them around because then they can't be called a monopoly. They're like useful fools in that sense, except again, they're the 1%ers. And he goes, so they just don't want to do anything. The thing is just you shuffle papers. So he, as a capitalist, said, I'm out of here. I want something more dynamic. And so he left that industry. Well, that's the problem. If we get comfortable in our ways, even when we have external events, let's say, like the closure of the strait, we're not thinking about alternatives. We're thinking about when is the strait going to open? This 51-day oil reserve stuff. It's like, are you serious? You think that the war is going to end in 51 days or that,
so you jumped from that cultural examination with that chicken farm to government. And what seems to be a common factor there is the safety of how it once was done and risk-averse approach to anything that may be happening now, and a lack of strategic visioning that may provide a different horizon in the near, medium or long term. An interesting thing here too, I think that comes to the surface, and if we get back to the polycentric observations and that you've been identifying there, is some of the, look, my feelings on hegemony, and that's not just an expression of government. It's also from the point of view of dominance from some of the, what I would term as more dangerous tech bro type endeavors. But if you look at Musk, I think leadership of these organizations, when we're confronting institutional lag and inertia, can often reflect the personality types of the leaders. If you look at Musk, he's a risk taker, and some of those tech bros seem to represent similar characteristics, where they've got to a size where they can afford to even advance the risk taking, even from the point of view of not abandoning, but building and leveraging on top of having made their bones to a very, very large degree in the private sector, really moving strategically into advancing to another level by tapping into the procurement pipelines of large governments and also the large structural network connections to those large governments, allies, etc. And we're talking Palantir here, we're talking Elon Musk's enterprise and things like that. So I think too it comes down to some of the types of people that perhaps societies push forward into leadership, whether it be government or into like the chicken farm you're giving the analysis of there. And it's an interesting dynamic. And both have their flaws, both bring their dangers to the table. The former being the chicken farm, losing intellectual potentials. We see that at a government level, policies of government and the brain drain, as we call it, where people are exiting because they're trying to establish a pathway in their careers, exiting the territorial responsibilities of countries like New Zealand to other countries overseas. The response from government seems to be that shrug of shoulder and saying, oh, well, when the conditions are right, they'll come back home. But that doesn't solve the problem, does it? So those are just some of the observations that I've pulled out of what you were talking about here. Bringing to the thing, the personality types is another factor perhaps that influences decision-making, both strategic, but even more so perhaps in the tactical response to challenge.
Yeah, it makes me think. For lack of a better phrase, I'd say that we live in the era of chaos agents. Trump is a chaos agent. I've said this before. Trump will be the seminal feature of the 21st century, for better or worse. If not the first half of the 21st century, but there are others. You mentioned them, Peter Thiel, Musk. But there's a problem with and they are visionary, not Trump, but Musk and Jeff Bezos doesn't strike me as a visionary.
No, but the other two clearly are. You can see Thiel's interest in PayPal and Musk's interest in PayPal all those years ago. I think they came down to that basic premise of business of providing a solution to a problem. And people, when they're embarking on trade on the internet and PayPal appears, this is a way we can actually facilitate a transaction. It's a solution. And that's where they obviously got the beginnings of their interests. But the risk taking was more so the more they were able to take those risks. And those personalities, I would say that, my concerns, I don't know if I can bring it up, probably I don't think I can bring it up today for some reason, but Palantir's Gotham and the attachments and the hybridization of intelligence, signals intelligence, human intelligence, and the Palantir platform itself, I would say, is another dimension of intelligence that pulls everything together. And it does appear that it'll be accurate to make claim now that facilitated the state of Israel when it targeted for assassination those 50 individuals in Iran right at the beginning of the phase 2 of this offensive against Iran. So, those kind of things, they come with it, with their huge risks and things like that. I'll back out of that. I just wanted to apply some elements of what we're talking about and perhaps look at the impact that the personality types of those at the top also have on the structures of choice, or the choice within structures is a better way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well worth dwell on. Again, that we're in an era of agency. As I said before, chaos agents. And the trouble is, it becomes a fundamental philosophical question, which is Musk, Thiel, that crowd, they're focused on efficiency. Let's say, to be kind, providing services, facilitating things. And this is why it's a fundamental question of our times, they're not so much interested in the humanity and the human ripple effects of building these efficiencies. And AI, of course, is a great point. But I'll give you an example. When you just mentioned the Iranians and whatnot, I'll give you an example. The decapitation strikes on the Iranian regime in the first days of the conflict were extremely efficient. I have a feeling that the Israeli targeting systems had a lot of Palantir in them. But what they managed to do was strengthen the regime. And this is how, and this is why humanity comes in. I happen to be reading English translations of Iranian international relations types. Some who live in Iran, but most who live abroad. And they're like, wow, talk about really backfiring. So you killed off the older religious leadership of the revolutionary regime. And what replaced them was a more militarized, secular regime that, yes, has younger clerics, but they don't have the power of Khamenei and his cohort.
But his son is the supreme leader that has not abandoned that type of thing. You've got the same president, you've got the same foreign minister.
Yeah, but his son does not have the power. The power is in the IRGC.
I think that has absolutely come to the fore where the Republican Guard, the Iranian Republican Guard, has seized its opportunity. The hard line elements is what you're talking about. They have been able to flex. They have obviously been well prepared for decades for this type of event. And now, to put it crudely, is their time to shine, right?
Yeah, I mean, I happen to... Well, I welcome the analyses because I'm a student of military, bureaucratic, authoritarian regimes in Latin America. I know that regime type. I've lived under those regime types. And I'm like, wow, you took out the religious extremists and hardliners of an older generation. You replace them with a younger generation that doesn't have the power. So their influence on the IRGC is less than it used to be. And these guys in the IRGC, not only are they blooded, because most of them were young men during the Iran-Iraq war. They fought that war. They saw American equipment on the Iraqi side. And but they're mostly now technocrats. See, in the United States, Southern families send their sons and daughters to university, and some of them join the military. There's the service academies. In Iran, like in Brazil, like in France, a lot of these elite families send their sons and daughters to elite universities, like the École Politique in France, and then they join the military, or then they go into the officer corps. These are intellectuals, but if you don't think they're intellectuals, then technocrats. And they have those Persian attributes of patience, discipline, lateral thinking. The Yanks, meanwhile,
high strategic sets.
They've got, right, exactly. They've got strategic hedging down. So I think, okay, the Iranians are telling us, they're scholars, they're saying, look at, you took out what was probably the easiest part of the regime to deal with, and you replace them with a bunch of 50-year-olds who are hardcore, and that's where my training comes in. They go, yeah, but these guys are less militant. No, you don't understand. They are still hardliners. They're just not as religious. There are hardliners and there are moderates. And the moderates are in the diplomatic corps. They speak nice English. They speak even better French because most Iranian diplomats are French trained. But no, there's no like crazy, guys running the show. These guys are all cold, but smart. But they're hardline. What are they hardline? Not Shia Islamicists. They're hardline Persian nationalists.
Yeah, so I'd get on that point there and the lessons that ought to have been learnt relating to the Vietnam War. And for those who have watched, Errol Morris's documentary, The Fog of War, with a one-on-one basically with McNamara, the lessons that were learnt, one of the lessons supposedly that were learnt from that conflict and carnage of Vietnam was that the Americans misread what they were fighting. From the United States administration's point of view, it was a belief that they were fighting an ideology which had an internationalist expression of itself. But when it boiled down to it, they were actually fighting peoples that wanted their country back. And they happened to see that the framework of a version of communism was the way to get a unified effort happening there. But take that lesson and place it into what you're describing here with Iran. They have misread that again, which accentuates why did they not learn that ideological wars as such, whatever form that they may show, is often, we talk about masks, a mask for what is happening underneath. We know too, from even down here in New Zealand, the diaspora from Iran have a very good reason for being located out of the country. And within that diaspora, it isn't one solid block. There are so many different versions of why and what is happening. But it does seem the most common thing is that it's an atrocity for the West, led by the United States, perhaps in Israel here, to have allowed this type of illegal war to have occurred in the first place. But sorry, Paul, I'm starting to get into the ideological myself here. But, your point there about what has come through is a very fascinating point, the point of nationalism, of Persian nationalism that goes back centuries. And maybe that's an interesting point to...
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I mean, that you're making me think, on the fly. And here's one that, again, I just thought this listening to you speak. Both in Vietnam and in Iran, ideology was not the cause. Okay, so there was the ideology, which is the vehicle, and the cause is nationalism. Right? They're fighting for their nation, and they use whatever vehicle happens to offer them the best support, in which case, Maoism, Marxism was good for the Vietnamese. Here it's a little more amorphous. But it's Islamicism or Shia Islamicism. But that's just the cover. You said it, the mask. The cause is nationalistic. And I think, that goes back to my point about bringing in the global South into previously Western-dominated institutions. Because all institutions at the end of the day are conflict resolution devices. They take what otherwise would be fights and turn them into disputes of a contractual nature, usually. And so, if you bring in the South and realize that, the cause is a post-colonial nationalism, a yearning to be at the table instead of being of the recipients of the unilateral actions of the global North, then I think that you can reform these institutions rather than just discard them. The Chinese are interesting because they seem to have to learn the lesson, but they seem not to, depending on where you go. So their dollar diplomacy in the Pacific, it's soft power, but it's still heavy-handed. It's too obvious, bribing people. In sub-Saharan Africa, the fact that they bring in Chinese workers for the Belt and Road Initiative, instead of hiring local labor, has now bred resentment in many countries by, working class people who are like, hey, where's the jobs for us? You brought in a bunch of Chinese people.
Because I think, too, on that, the natural way of approaching that, if you were the person on the street thinking, they've shut us out from being a part of the workforce and that we're not benefiting now, the likelihood is that we're not going to benefit once Belt and Road is actually up and running and prospering different elites in this region. So, those types of things. Paul, let's start to tie up all of these things and pull them together and land on a place, perhaps. I'll put it back to you on that. That's a task and a half, but let's see where we go with it.
It'll be hard to see these current conflicts shaking out anytime soon. I mean, the ceasefire, all of that. And we didn't get into the diverging agendas of Israel and the United States. Uh, that's going to keep this thing going because Israel is not, they've committed. In fact, with some of the talk about Lebanon now, they're showing their hand with this greater Israel agenda. And I never thought I'd say that. But, when they start openly talking about taking over Lebanon, I think they've rolled the dice heavily in one direction. And no one seems to understand that, we always talk about it, but that with Trump, loyalty is a one-way street. Yeah. That he does what we were, in the family we were talking, he does high and low betrayal. So he does petty betrayals of plumbers and house painters and, rescinds on payments and whatnot. But he does high level betrayals, such as committing to Netanyahu to wipe out the Persian civilization using American air power. Then, when he realizes he can't deliver and he's been outfoxed, he quits. He quits because he's got a midterm that he knows he's going to cost the Republicans the majority in Congress. Netanyahu has an election. The date is not determined, but it's going to be October, November. He's going to go the other way. He's going to try to increase this war and say it's Israel. We're on our own now. So I see things getting a lot worse over the immediate term, and the tactical hedging would have to be, forget about this 51-day nonsense and realize this thing is not stopping. And
in a sense, just on that, before we, go further, in a way, I'm struggling for the word, but I'll land on the diplomacy, the Trump administration's diplomatic efforts to try and find an off-ramp. There'll be better words for it, but I don't want to fall into the cynical.
Yeah.
In a sense, in that kind of arena, it seems that we have seen J.D. Vance move more into that space to protect Trump, in a sense, from Israel's clear, obvious, overt abuse of the terms that Trump is negotiating with the Iranians. And it's almost like Trump's administration has found themselves diplomatically on two fronts. It is protecting itself and attempting to show supremacy over Israel's strategic goals. It's trying to push forward while trying to get Iran to comply to its supposed might is right type of ideals. And it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And I just wonder where, when we consider what we've discussed today, how that is, once again, the choice of words is not right, but how that is played out over the short term. When you've got the strategic goal sets of supposed two allies are so different from each other that we see the tactics deployed by Israel to disrupt negotiations in the diplomatic arena. And we see the attempts of Trump's people trying to navigate that to protect Trump's tough guy image, but failing to do so. We're within the boundaries of what we talked about with strategic and tactical. What do you see in the short term on this?
Well, I see some very strange tactical things. Let me just say, as a reminder, when you have a contest of any sort between a recognizably more powerful actor and a recognizably weaker actor, especially in warfare, any tie, any draw is a victory for the weaker actor. So a ceasefire peace deal with Iran is a victory for Iran and then some. I mean, they have the leverage, they have the cards, and Trump and his minions look increasingly desperate. Now, what about his minions? Well, Trump and his crowd are doing tactical hedging, but this is what they're doing. I slightly disagree with you on this one. J.D. Vance is being set up for a fall, the mother of all falls. And I love it. I love it. He can go back and hump a couch. The fact of the matter is, he was the one person in the Situation Room who argued against starting a war with Iran. You know, little Marco Rubio, you know, the Tulsi Gabbard, all that crowd is, yeah, Netanyahu's right. Everything Netanyahu said is going to happen. We're going to bomb the Ayatollah. They're going to roll over, and we're going to march in as liberators. So Vance is like, I don't think that's a good idea. They ignore him. They do it. Now, because he has presidential aspirations, and so does little Marco, Trump has decided, you know what? We're going to make Vance not the Secretary of State, but Vance the key man to negotiate the deal with Iran, the guy who opposed attacking them. And I'm going to put my son-in-law and my best criminal real estate agent friend on either side of him lest he get out of line. So the talks are doomed to fail. And Trump has said this openly. If they fail, he's going to blame JD. So Vance is finished. Vance is finished. And you look at him and he's dead man walking. He knows it. Okay,
Reuters
set him up.
Look, yeah, it's not a binary thing, but I think you're right in a sense there. And this is an opportunity that Trump would not ever miss, you know, obviously. And if Reuters put out an amazing photograph that captured what you're talking about this morning, where basically J.D. Vance has been stood up at the party and he is looking over his shoulder. And it was a brilliant kind of thing from that point of view of illustration, I think. David Mooring just brought up here the actions of the extreme of the right wing is putting the centre-right voters in all countries. That's something that David's been putting, he's been trying to draw us into an examination of right-wing political interests that are playing out on the global stage. And, you know, there's a whole program in that, but we'll probably, just letting you know, David, we probably won't go there today. I'll just bring that down.
Yeah, no, that's anyway, another show. But, you know, that's...
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, David, that's a good point. The fracturing of the right in the wake of the Israel-U.S. Iran war, that would be a great episode. But that factors into what I was saying about Trump and dealing to Vance. They got a midterm election. Support for Israel is at all-time lows throughout the political spectrum, including Republicans. In order to get any chance of recovery and at least hold on to one of the houses of Congress, some distance will have to be taken on Israel. And Netanyahu knows that better than everybody else. So he's going to make it very hard for traditional pro-Israeli establishment Republicans to get away from them. You know, like I say, I think he's going to expand the war well into Lebanon. And, you know, again, that's a whole new can of worms. But the issue is Israel is no longer going to be guaranteed. Talk about systemic change. The carte blanche that it's been given by the U.S. taxpayer when it comes to its behavior in its own neighborhood. Those days, I think, are rapidly coming to the end because of its behavior. And so a lot of people are like, yeah, October 7th, you needed to deal to Hamas. But 3 years later, what on earth are we doing? We're bombing Iran. You're in Lebanon. There's a lot of concern. And a lot of it's focused on costs. So the Republicans
Those
drawing
that
the line. Look at the
those that subscribe to the effort that Netanyahu has been doing may point to the polling in Israel, which says 78% agree with much of what has gone on, but disagree on different parts of it. But the overall thrust of what Netanyahu has led them into has got very broad agreement. In fact, the north of Israel, like all of those that are watching the program would know, Netanyahu's been criticised for not being hardline enough. What that says in the United States, though, is something quite different, doesn't it? Where you've got perhaps the Trump administration illustrates how a generational shift has been in play for some time, and that tide has been held back by some sort of fossilized version of 20th century thinking. And it might be that when that is released, support for Israel, however it is defined relating to the United States' commitment to Israel to defend it when under threat, may be very closely defined on true and authentic defence, as opposed to what we are seeing of offensive invasion and mass murder and breaches of what was once considered all the elements of genocide. So on that, Paul, let's wrap it up. It's been a good episode. We've come through. We've landed on the application of the theoretical. Let's tie this up now.
Yeah, okay. It's a good point. And let's see the strategic hedging from the U.S. point of view. Cut the weapons and financial lifelines to Israel. Not entirely, but I'd say if you halved the amount of weapons and money you sent to Israel, they change their behavior. Sure, it makes 78% of Israelis happy that they can still kick other people's rears with impunity, but you remove their ability to do so in the same measure, they might start thinking slightly different. And the American public, I won't say it's irretrievable, but again, that's the tactical and strategic stuff, but also the individual, micro, macro. A lot of individual U.S. people are now for the first time thinking, why do we support Israel? It used to be Israel good, the Arabs bad, Muslims bad, Jewish people good. And now it's like, that's not quite as black and white as that. Once you put, for voters, the easiest thing is black and white. And I'll leave you with this. What you want to do as a politician is make it clear to your constituencies there's a black or white answer. I'm with white, the other guy's with black, go with me. Once you throw shades of gray in, where they can think, well, the other guy sort of got a point, now you're in trouble. And we've moved from the black and white phase of the view of Israel to now a lot of shades of gray across the ideological spectrum in the U.S. and elsewhere, I'd say globally. And so this systemic change that I've been talking about, we're thinking of the West and Western liberal democracies, but it's systemic in that it encompasses the totality of global affairs. And that includes places like the Middle East looking at themselves, the Israelis looking at themselves. And today we didn't bother talking a lot about Asia, but the big beneficiaries outside of Iran in all of this conflict are the Asian giants, the PRC in particular.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for bringing what is a really solid framework of how to apply that type of thinking into the current events that we all see and also in our daily lives. Really appreciate that. And thank you to those that have invested their time in watching this podcast or indeed listening to it via the podcast platforms around. We really appreciate that too. As is our way, Paul and I plan to be back around about mid next month, so mid-July, and we will pick up once again some interesting issues, interesting thinking, and we will go down deep, as they say, in trying to get an understanding at a more deeper level. Till that time, ka kite anō, and take care out there, and we look forward to your company once again in the very near future. Thank you. Bye-bye.